fellow Egyptologists. This video will be talking more about chronology. I will be focusing on the second intermediate period, a summary of the greater context of the ancient Near East, or ANE, and then a summary of the New Kingdom. So my last video, I talked about the end of the Middle Kingdom. Similar to what we've done in the past, I'm going to pull my PowerPoint screen up here. Slideshow. Okay, so we are going to get started. This is a slide that you have seen before, and I've put it in here, and I'll keep putting it in here to have in the forefront of your mind the greater chronological context. So previous videos have talked about prehistory and the pre-dynastic, the early dynastic, the old kingdom, a quick bit about the first intermediate period, and then the last video really focused on the Middle Kingdom. So this video is going to talk about the second intermediate period and the kingdom. You've seen this graphic before as well, and it gives you those approximate calendar dates for most of those periods, because as we've talked about, the further back you go, the more tentative those dates become. So the chronology that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to end with the New Kingdom, because that is where at least some of the characters from the movie are from, that or the Old Kingdom. But just know that there is other periods after the New Kingdom, primarily the third intermediate and the late period. By the time you get to the New Kingdom, dates are firmer, but still not rock solid. And then by the time you get to particularly the late period, you have dates that are on firmer foundation, because you have a lot more documents from different cultures that you can cross-check against each other. And that simply is not true for the Old Kingdom, and even more so for the pre-dynastic and prehistoric period before that. So I'm going to give some of the highlights. Most Egyptologists, at least at this point in time, place dynasties 14 through 17 in the second intermediate. As I talked about last video, there are some dynasties that the periods that they're placed in is debated, and the 13th dynasty is one of those. So I think previous generations of Egyptologists had put it in the second intermediate according to Digital Egypt, which is done by University College London, and Dr. Quirk and his team. The current majority of Egyptologists puts the 13th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom, and so they have the second intermediate period start with Dynasty 14 and end with Dynasty 17. The second intermediate period is that second period of disunity, where we have multiple dynasties in power at the same time, and they're all claiming rulership. It's around 150 years, because again, the exact depends on which dynasties you're putting in the second intermediate versus the Middle Kingdom. In the second intermediate, you have for the first time a non-Egyptian family, which is the 15th dynasty that rules over part of Egypt, which is the Hyksos in the city of Avaris, which seems to be their capital city. The treatment of the 15th dynasty and how they came into Egypt is something that has definitely undergone a sea change in terms of Egyptological trends. So that's something that in the extra PowerPoint that I've uploaded, those slides go into more depth about kind of how Egyptologists' view of the 15th dynasty has changed over time, because it's very different than what it was in, say, 1930. The end of the Second Intermediate is marked by continuation of the trend that we saw first in the Middle Kingdom, where you have a local dynasty from Thebes that gains enough power to basically do a civil war, although the writings that we have kind of from their side, they frame it as a war of liberation sort of thing. They eventually get enough power to reunify the whole of Egypt. And so the dynasty that begins the new kingdom is the 18th. But it's the main steps to reunify Egypt were taken by those last few rulers of the 17th dynasty. And again, the extra PowerPoint goes into more depth with some of those particular rulers and kind of the different parts that they played. Also in the Second Intermediate, you have the site of Dra Abu al-Naga that starts to be used as a burial for the local royal family. This is the general area that the valleys of the kings and queens will develop in when you get into the new kingdom proper. In what the Egyptians called Nubia, which is broadly speaking modern day Sudan, we have a couple things happening in the second, or we have lots of things happening in the Second Intermediate, but some of the major things are in much of that area. We have an independent, quite powerful kingdom that flourishes during much of the Second Intermediate that the Egyptians refer to as the Kingdom of Kerma. We also have populations of Nubians moving into Egypt proper. And again, the scholarship has changed over the years in terms of their interactions with the native Egyptians and why you have Nubians that are wanting to move into the Nile Valley as well. So I'm going to give a summary of some of the political history first. Like I alluded to before, the Second Intermediate period is one of those times of political decentralization. So we have multiple dynasties in power at the same time that are all claiming overall rulership of Egypt. So for instance, we have in Thebes, we have the 16th and 17th dynasties, which the 16th, I think, is one of the native Theban dynasties, or seems to be at least before the emergence of the 17th. So the 15th and 16th dynasties are roughly contemporary in time. And then we have the 14th dynasty, which is one of those early local dynasties after the sort of end of the Middle Kingdom that seems to control the part of Egypt that is along the eastern fringes of the Eastern Delta. And something to keep in mind with both the Second Intermediate periods and the other intermediate periods, so the first and the third, is that again, the way that scholarship has viewed these periods has changed a good amount from 19th, early 20th century to now. So if you look at early Egyptology, relying for a lot of this on writings from kind of the Egyptian point of view of the rulers of the New Kingdom, is that these are very dark periods of time filled with lots of violence and chaos, and just everybody was having a really bad time. The more nuanced version is that just because you have decentralized political authority doesn't mean that everything else went to pot on day one. So an argument has been made that I definitely find some validity to, that for some of the average Egyptians, so if you were an average Egyptian in Abydos or in Elephantine or kind of anywhere along that Nile River, your daily life might not have actually changed that much once you no longer have a centralized state. You probably had access to less resources because you don't have a centralized state anymore. You don't have the same amount of and breadth of trade networks that you had when you have one central state authority. But people are still being buried. People are still doing temple things. They're still engaging in religious rituals. So the average Egyptian, even in these intermediate periods, is still having a daily life. And so that's something else to kind of keep in mind. And if you are interested in investigate on a deeper level in terms of kind of how current Egyptology is looking at these intermediate periods and trying to get the viewpoint of sort of the average Egyptian rather than the Egyptians at the very top. So this is a map from Wikicommons, and it gives you a context for what's happening in the greater, what practitioners who study this call the Ancient Near East, or ANE, and what we broadly refer to now as the modern Middle East, what's kind of going on there during a lot of this second intermediate period in Egypt, because when you get to the New Kingdom, you have a lot of what's happening in the ANE directly impacting events in New Kingdom Egypt and the rulership there. So this map is around 1700 BCE. And if you notice for the second intermediate period, it gives the 13th dynasty. So that goes back to what we were talking about, where the 13th dynasty is one of those dynasties that its periodization has shifted over time. So this map puts it in the second intermediate rather than at the end of the Middle Kingdom. This is that modern state, or that Nubian state of Kerma that we talked that I talked about, that flourished, or at least part of it flourished in what is, broadly speaking, modern day Sudan. And then throughout the second intermediate period, because here you're getting into the Nile River and the Nile Valley proper, you have different dynasties that claim different portions of these areas here. In the ancient ANE, so in Egypt, we're looking at the end of the Middle Kingdom according to the kind of current Egyptological consensus. You have multiple things going on. So in modern day Greece, on the island of Crete, you have the Minoans, which are the dominant culture. On the mainland, you have the Mycenaeans. In what is now modern day Turkey, you have the Hittites as the rising power. And when you get to the New Kingdom proper in Egypt, the Hittites are a diplomatic entity that the New Kingdom rulers will have to deal with in different ways. In modern day Syria, you have the entity of Yamhad. And then when you get to this chunk here, you're getting into modern day Iraq. So in this part of modern day Iraq, you have the city-state of Babylon that is the sort of main regional power. When you're starting to get up to this part of Iraq, you are having the emergence of the Assyrians. The Assyrians go through multiple cultural phases. The cultural phase that they're most famous for comes later in the Iron Age. And people who study this region of the world have given that phase the title of Neo-Assyrian culture. And that is the phase that when the Bible talks about the Assyrians, that's the rough time span that they're referencing. And then in modern day Iraq, modern day Iran, you have the kingdom of Elam. So now we're going 100 plus years forward in time, and Egypt, it's still the second intermediate. The Hyksos, that 15th dynasty, which their capital is Avaris, have now taken control of kind of this chunk. Again, the methods and the exact dating of Hyksos' arrival in Egypt is something that has changed in Egyptology based on new evidence that has emerged. And so in my extra PowerPoint, there's a few slides that go into more depth about that and kind of the Egyptology's changing ideas about them. Because we're getting to the sort of end of the second intermediate period, we are in modern day, in ancient Thebes, modern day Luxor area. We have the emergence of the 17th dynasty, maybe, and then we have in what the Egyptians called Nubia, broadly speaking, modern day Sudan, we still have that powerful state of Kerma. In the larger ancient Near East, we have still in Crete, the Minoans are the dominant power, with the Mycenaeans and mainland Greece. In modern day Turkey, Haiti has taken even more land and even more power, so the Hittites are still the main people there. The Assyrians in modern day Iraq are still there, but they're not as powerful. So if you look at this map, you can tell like the blue chunk when you get to around 1600 BCE is not as large. In the other part of modern day Iraq, you still have the city-state of Babylon that is the dominant power, but a new basically family has taken control. And then in modern day Iran, you still have the kingdom of Elam. And again, in my extra PowerPoint, I go into more depth about the individual rulers of the 17th dynasty that were really active in starting that civil war and reunifying Egypt, and the different types of evidence that we have for that. Most of the evidence comes from the 17th dynasty, so it comes from the winning side, so to speak. So there's a question of sort of how much truth there is in those sources. Now I'm going to go into a little bit of social history of the second intermediate, because there are some important social history type things that are happening. And then after that, we're going to go into the New Kingdom, both its social and political history as well. So, and this is something that I'm going to talk about in more depth in the New Kingdom. One of the main social phenomena that we see starting to develop in the second intermediate is something that Egyptologists have termed the democratization of the afterlife, which is basically the symbols of the afterlife and kind of ways to get there that you saw or that were in the old kingdom just linked or seemingly just used by the royal families and members of those royal families. In the second intermediate, and even before that in the Middle Kingdom, you start to see those elements and use of those elements trickling down into different members of Egyptian society. And then one of the other major things that we see towards the end of the second intermediate period that really crystallizes in the New Kingdom is the emergence of Thebes that we saw back in the Middle Kingdom as one of the main centers of power rather than the Egyptian Delta region. So again, we've seen this slide a few times now, just to give you that long-term chronology. We're going to be talking about the New Kingdom in a little bit more depth here. Again, you've seen these calendar years, so we're going to be talking about this chunk of time here. Generally speaking, the dynasties that Egyptologists have put into the New Kingdom are dynasties 18 through dynasty 20. Again, the dates are firmer, but not rock solid. So depending on the dating that you're using, the New Kingdom is around 500 years. And then within those 500 years, based on trends of rulership or religious trends, there is sub-periods that Egyptologists have divided it into as well. So the Marna Age and then the Ramesside period are sub-periods of this New Kingdom, 500-ish year time span. And then the New Kingdom is overall this third major period of Egypt as one centralized state. Like I've said before, Thebes becomes one of the main political and religious centers. That doesn't mean that Memphis is suddenly abandoned, that it loses all its cultic and religious importance, and that it's not used as one of the capitals in some sense in the New Kingdom. Memphis is still all those things to some extent. It's just not the main one like it was in the Old Kingdom. It's in the New Kingdom that you have the temple sites of Karnak and Luxor, so where modern day Luxor is, become these full-fledged multiple temple sites, and really sites to show royal patronage and power. And this continues post New Kingdom for both these sites as well. In terms of royal burial, the New Kingdom sees again continuation of trends that we saw in the Middle Kingdom. So one of the things that I talked about in the last video is that beginning with Mentuhotep II, we have the distance where the ruler's physical body is buried versus her or his mortuary temple. We have those two sites ever further and further apart. And so the New Kingdom really completes that trend where the pyramid shape as the royal tomb is abandoned and the royal family switches to the actual burial being in the rock-cut tombs of the valleys of the kings and queens. And then their mortuary temples are on the other side of the valley in basically one long line. We also have the democratization of the afterlife that really gets revved up. So some ways that you see this are you have the use of funerary text deriving from the pyramid text that we saw in the Old Kingdom in non-royal tombs. So this is something that we first saw in a pretty big the Middle Kingdom, and then it continues throughout the New Kingdom and after as well. We also have the pyramid form as part of your burial complex its use spread to non-royal Egyptians. So like at the workman's village of Deir el-Medina, their above ground tomb structures incorporate a mini pyramidal form. Not all of them, but more than one of them does. It's also in the New Kingdom that Egyptologists, or at least a large portion of Egyptologists, argue that the Egyptian state really goes on the offensive and actively carves out an empire, whether leading campaigns on their own or sending out their soldiers and generals to kind of do it by proxy, of really claiming land and territory outside of Egypt. Linked back with the democratization of the afterlife, you have Osiris really becomes the main funeral deity. Abydos, that site that we saw shift from royal to non-royal burial use in the Middle Kingdom, is still used for non-royal burial in the New Kingdom, and it's still a pilgrimage site. That independent second intermediate period Nubian state of Kerma, in the New Kingdom, that state is conquered by Egypt, and Egypt, an argument can and has been made that Egypt fully colonizes Nubia in our sense of the word. Again, the discipline of Egyptology over time has shifted how it looks at that process, and really the Eurocentrist and kind of imperialistic assumptions that early Egyptologists brought to the table when they were thinking kind of about how that happened. So that's something else, if you want to dig deeper, it's something else that has really changed within modern Egyptology in terms of how we look at that process. Okay. So now I'm going to very briefly go into some of the political history, and in particular, very briefly, how we get these subdivisions. So as I said before, overall, depending on how you date things, the New Kingdom is around 500 years. Within those 500 years, there are chunks of time that things change enough, or there's multiple rulers with the same name, that they've been given basically their own sub period. So we have the Amarna period, which is members of the 18th dynasty, and there is sufficient religious change at the royal level and change in artwork and motifs and things like that, that it's been given its own age. We also have the Ramesside period, which comes after the Amarna period, which is primarily rulers of the 19th and I think somewhat into the 20th dynasty as well. And that period has been given that name because there's multiple rulers, one after the other, that all take the name, that all take as one of their throne names Ramses or Ramm because they're trying to recapture kind of the glory days of Ramses the Second, or Ramses the Great, as he is kind of more popularly known. So these are the individual rulers of Dynasty from digital Egypt. So when you get to this part here, you're getting into the different rulers of the Amarna period. These rulers up here before, there's a couple in kind of this mix here that really go on the offensive in terms of carving territory and claiming territory for Egypt outside of its borders. And then in Dynasty 19, you have, that's after the Amarna period, so that's the Restoration, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as, which is basically they're restoring the traditional religious pantheon. And so this is where we get the reign of Ramses II. And then you get to Dynasty 20, and that is the majority of the Ramesside period. So if you look here, Ramses the third, Ramses the fourth, Ramses the fifth, so it just goes on and on. And again, in the extra PowerPoint, there are slides that go into more detail about some of these rulers and kind of the individual things that they did. And these slides also go into greater detail of how Egypt sort of joined the diplomatic network of the greater Bronze Age world in Dynasty 18. So now I'm going to a little bit of social history. Some of these points I've already touched on. So I've already talked about the democratization of the afterlife. And one of the major things that we see with that is use of the Book of the Dead as a primary funerary text for non-royal Egyptians. In terms of overall burial trends, towards the end of the Second Intermediate and 18th Dynasty, so beginning of the New Kingdom, one of the main things that we see is that objects of daily use are the main things that are put in the tombs. And so the objects that are made just for the grave shift to coffins, so the actual container slash containers that the body would be placed in. Canopic boxes, which are meant to basically hold the wet organs, because if you look at the greater Egyptian ideas about the afterlife, there was a belief that the body needed to be whole and intact for you to rise when you got to that next plane of existence. However, they were also aware that if the wet organs were left in the body, from a practicality standpoint, your body would start to rot. So the canopic boxes were a way to kind of solve that issue. And then we have Shoptis that appear as well, which one of the interpretations for these objects is that they are figures that magically awaken in the afterlife to labor on your behalf for any work that you're called on to do. And these are some of the daily life objects that are found in 18th Dynasty tombs. And then we get into the Ramesside period, so end of 19th Dynasty, 20th Dynasty, and we have objects of daily use not really being put in tombs anymore on a large scale. And it's switching back to goods that are seemingly made just for the burial. And so this is some objects that are found in some of these elite tombs and then some of the poorer tombs. We still have books of the dead, though. And again, this is from the Digital Egypt site. So now I'm going to talk in a little bit more depth about how the sites of Karnak and Luxor developed. Again, even more detail on this can be found in the extra PowerPoint that I've uploaded, because there really is just so much history there for both of these sites. So these are videos that either show you Karnak in kind of its, or an idea of Karnak in its full glory, when all the ceilings and doors and the full color was still there, and then a little bit of Karnak as it is today as well. This is a graphic from Wiki Commons, and I realize that it's in French, but it does still show some overall trends, which is why I've it. So one of the things that you see at Karnak and the different temple complexes that kings or that pharaohs, because by this time pharaohs is the term that is used. One of the things that you see is that the deities or main deities that they pay for temples to be erected towards or in devotion of changes over time. So at the beginning of the new kingdom, Matu seems to be the sort of primary deity of this area. So we have different temples paid for by different rulers that are erected to him. By the time you get to parts of the 18th dynasty and after, you have the god Amun that seems to have sort of superseded Matu as the main deity of this Karnak area and kind of these temple sites. And so all of this is different temples that were paid for by rulers over times to the deity Amun in his different forms. And it's also the part of Karnak that is the most accessible to modern tourists. So if you go to Karnak now, the area that you'll be most freely able to walk through is this chunk here, which is the domain of Amun, rather than the domain of Matu or the domain of Mut, which is Mut is the main goddess that sort of is paid homage to on parts of the site as well. This is, again, if you go to Karnak as a modern tourist, this is, I'm pretty sure, the entrance that you'll enter now. But in pharaonic times, this would have been the main entrance to Amun's chunk. Because of the popularity of Amun, kind of his dominance, you also, by the New Kingdom, you have the priesthood of Amun that becomes quite politically powerful and quite independently wealthy from the crown, which causes some issues. Then we also have the temple site of Luxor. So like Karnak, Luxor is not one temple, but it's many temples, literally over thousands of years, from definitely the New Kingdom, but there might have been one or two Middle Kingdom rulers that paid for different temples or different structures to be erected in Luxor. But the main building mania in Luxor and Karnak comes in the New Kingdom, and then in Luxor, it's used as a royal site for display and power and prestige, or just general religious use, all the way down to the Muslim period. So this is another graphic from Wiki Commons. As far as I know, it's still the site map that's at the current site. So if you go to Luxor Temple as a tourist, this is the kind of guide that you'll see. And so I have zoomed in on different parts to kind of give you just an idea of how long the history of this site stretches. So this is the original core of the temples. So we have rulers of the 18th dynasty, so primarily Amenhotep III, pay for temple and structures to be erected in kind of this general area here. A little while later, when we get to the reign of Ramses II, we have temple structures that he paid for to be erected as well. And then later on, when you have Egypt lose its independence as a kingdom, and you have the Romans come in, they use and build on Karnak as well. So you have a Roman shrine. There's a Roman closure wall. So Luxor still has spiritual significance that the Romans want to claim and kind of take advantage of. And then even after that, when you have the arrival of the Muslim, or when you have the arrival of Christianity in Egypt in the 300s, 400s AD, you have a Christian church that is built on the site of Luxor as well. So it's still a place of spiritual power. And then after that, when you have the Muslim forces come in the 900s AD, you have them build a mosque and utilize part of the site for their religious services, and they eventually have a village there as well that they use the mosque. So all of these different chunks represent literally safely 3,000 plus years of activity, and almost certainly more. All right, so this is where I'm going to stop with the chronology. The next chunk of videos will talk about the historicity of some of the characters from the 1999 film, particularly Imhotep, Ankh-Asa-Mun, and Seti the First. And I hope that you'll tune in for those videos as well. And just remember that, as with any archaeological field, the findings and the consensus changes based on archaeological evidence that comes out of the ground. And that's what's so cool about it, is that they may find something next week, that completely changes a lot of the interpretations of even one of the interpretations of evidence that I've talked about in this video. And that's what I find so awesome. So hopefully I'll see my fellow Egyptologists in the next set of videos, and feel free to peruse the second extra PowerPoint for more in-depth info of some of the things that I just kind of quickly summarized here.